The courtroom was filled with tension as the trial of Malik began. He was a young black boy, barely 18, sitting nervously in the dock, his hands tightly clasped together. His heart pounded in his chest, and his thoughts raced. He couldn't believe he was here, facing charges that he knew were not true. He had done nothing wrong, yet the evidence against him seemed overwhelming. The judge, Judge Peterson, was known for being strict, especially when it came to cases involving black defendants. Malik had heard stories about how Judge Peterson had ruled harshly in the past, showing little mercy. It was no secret that some believed the judge had biases that influenced his decisions, but Malik tried to stay hopeful. He believed in justice, in fairness, even though it felt like the odds were stacked against him. As the trial started, Malik's defense attorney, Mr. Thompson, stood up to present his case. He was a seasoned public defender, passionate about his job. But Malik could sense his frustration. The prosecution seemed determined to make an example of Malik. The evidence they presented was circumstantial, but it painted a picture that made Malik look guilty. A witness testified that they had seen a person who looked like Malik near the scene of the crime, though there was no solid proof linking him to it. There were fingerprints, but they were smudged, unclear. The prosecutor pushed hard, claiming that Malik was involved in something much larger than just this one crime. Malik felt the weight of the accusations pressing down on him. His mind raced, trying to think of ways to prove his innocence. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but he didn't have the right resources to defend himself properly. His family was poor, and hiring a private attorney was not an option. Mr. Thompson did his best, but Malik could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He wasn't sure how much longer he could fight this alone. His family sat in the back of the courtroom, their faces filled with worry. His mother, a hard-working woman who had always tried to protect him from the harsh realities of the world, kept her eyes locked on Malik, hoping he could get through this. His younger sister, too, was there, her small face a picture of fear and confusion. They had always been there for him, always believed in his good heart. But now, it seemed like everything was falling apart. Malik's mother whispered to herself, praying that this would be over soon, that the truth would come out. As the trial continued, Malik couldn't help but feel the injustice of it all. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but that shouldn't have been enough to ruin his life. Yet here he was, standing accused, with no way to clear his name. And as the prosecutor's arguments grew louder, Malik's hope began to waver. It felt like no one was listening, like the system was rigged against him from the start. But Malik refused to give up. He had to believe that there was still a chance for justice, that there was still a way for the truth to come out. The courtroom felt like a battleground, and Malik was determined to fight, even if the fight seemed impossible. As the trial continued, the prosecution worked tirelessly to make Malik seem guilty. The courtroom atmosphere became heavier with each passing moment, as the prosecutor, Mr. Davis, spoke with confidence. He painted a picture of Malik being involved in a crime that seemed more complicated than anyone had imagined. He claimed that Malik was not just in the wrong place at the wrong time, but that he had actively participated in the crime. Every word Mr. Davis spoke seemed carefully chosen to push the idea that Malik was a criminal, despite the lack of solid evidence. The prosecution presented witnesses who said they had seen someone near the scene of the crime. They were sure the person was Malik, but their testimonies were shaky at best. Some had seen a figure from a distance, while others had heard voices but couldn't quite remember details. But to the prosecutor, it was enough. Mr. Davis argued that the presence of Malik near the crime scene was proof enough, even if there was no real connection to the crime itself. Then came the evidence. The prosecutor held up a piece of clothing found near the scene, claiming that Malik's fingerprints were all over it. But when the defense attorney, Mr. Thompson, cross-examined the witness who found the item, it became clear that the fingerprints were unclear. They were smudged, difficult to identify. Malik's defense attorney pointed out how easy it was for anyone to leave prints on something, especially in a place where so many people passed through. But despite this, the prosecutor pressed on, convinced that the case against Malik was solid. Malik sat in the dock, trying to process everything that was happening. His stomach churned with anxiety as he listened to the prosecutor's words. He knew he wasn't guilty, but the way the evidence was being presented made it seem as if he were. His hands tightened into fists at his sides, and he could feel the sweat starting to form on his forehead. Each statement from the prosecutor made him feel smaller, more powerless. In the back of the courtroom, Malik's mother and sister watched with growing concern. They could see the stress in Malik's face, and it hurt them to know that there was little they could do. His mother had always told him to stay strong, to stand tall in the face of adversity, but she could see the toll this was taking on him. She wanted to stand up and scream that her son was innocent, but she knew it wouldn't help. Instead, she sat quietly, praying for a miracle. Mr. Thompson, Malik's defense attorney, kept trying to challenge the prosecution's evidence, but it felt like an uphill battle. With every move he made, the prosecutor seemed to have an answer, a rebuttal that pushed the case further toward Malik's guilt. Mr. Thompson spoke of doubt, about how no one could be sure that Malik had been involved, but the courtroom wasn't listening. The judge, Judge Peterson, seemed unfazed by the defense's arguments. He didn't appear to be swayed by the weaknesses in the prosecution's case. Malik began to feel like his fate was sealed. The more the trial dragged on, the more Malik's sense of hope dwindled. He knew that even if his attorney did his best, it might not be enough. The thought of going to prison for a crime he didn't commit was terrifying. Malik didn't know how much more he could endure. He tried to focus on the small moments of hope, his family's support, his lawyer's determination, but it felt like those were slipping away with each passing minute. As the day drew to a close, Malik wondered if anyone would believe him. He had always been taught to trust in the system, to believe that truth would come out in the end. But now, more than ever, it felt like that wasn't going to happen. As the trial reached its climax, Malik's heart raced. He had been sitting in the courtroom for hours, listening to the accusations against him. The stress and anxiety were starting to take their toll, but he knew he had to hold on. This was the moment that could change everything. He had to make the judge, the jury, and everyone else believe in his innocence. He had to make them see the truth. When it was his turn to speak, Malik felt a lump form in his throat. He had never been one for public speaking, and the thought of standing before everyone in the room made his palms sweat. But this was his chance to tell his side of the story, and he knew he couldn't back down now. He took a deep breath and stood up slowly, trying to steady his nerves. Malik's voice trembled as he began. "I didn't do it," he said, his words barely audible at first. But as he spoke, they grew stronger. "I swear to you, I didn't do what they're accusing me of. I don't know how I ended up here, but I'm not guilty." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. The judge, the prosecutor, and everyone else in the courtroom were watching him closely. "I've worked hard all my life. I've never been in trouble before. I'm just a kid trying to make something of myself." His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed on. "I know it might seem like I'm guilty. I know the evidence looks bad. But I promise you, I didn't commit this crime." He glanced at his mother, who was sitting in the back, her eyes full of worry. "I didn't do this to my family. I didn't do this to myself. I don't deserve this." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Malik could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him. His words hung in the air, as if everyone was waiting for him to say something more. The tension was thick, and he felt like the walls were closing in on him. But he kept going, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Please, just give me a chance. Don't let them decide my future for me. I'm not a criminal." His defense attorney, Mr. Thompson, was sitting beside him, his expression serious. He placed a hand on Malik's shoulder, offering silent support. The defense had tried to argue the case on the grounds of doubt, but now Malik knew it was his turn to make a difference. He could see that the prosecutor was not giving up easily, but this was his moment to show everyone that the case was not as clear-cut as it seemed. Malik took another deep breath, trying to calm himself. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice softening. "I'm scared because I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if I'll ever get a chance to prove that I'm innocent." He paused, looking at the judge. "But I'm asking you to see the truth. I'm asking you to see who I really am. I'm not some criminal, and I don't belong in prison." For a moment, it seemed like time stood still. The judge didn't immediately speak, and the room was filled with an almost tangible silence. Malik's heart pounded as he waited, unsure of what would happen next. He had said everything he could. Now it was out of his hands. He could only hope that the judge would see the sincerity in his words, that he would recognize Malik's innocence. The entire courtroom held its breath as Judge Peterson looked at Malik, his face unreadable. In the back of the room, Malik's mother wiped a tear from her eye. She had always known her son was a good person, but hearing him speak so passionately about his innocence made her heart swell with pride. She knew that her son had done everything he could, and now she could only hope that justice would prevail. The silence continued for a few more moments before the judge finally spoke. His words were slow, deliberate, and heavy. Everyone in the courtroom was on edge, waiting to hear what he would say. Malik's future hung in the balance. Just as the silence stretched on, the unexpected happened. The sharp sound of a phone ringing cut through the stillness of the courtroom. It was so sudden, so out of place, that for a moment, no one knew what to make of it. All eyes turned toward Judge Peterson, who had been sitting motionless, his face a mask of unreadable expression. The phone call, in the middle of such an intense moment, seemed almost like a distraction, but it was clear from the judge's reaction that it wasn't something trivial. Judge Peterson hesitated for a moment, looking down at his desk where his phone had vibrated once more. The tension in the room increased as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The prosecutor, Mr. Davis, seemed startled, and Malik's defense attorney, Mr. Thompson, looked equally confused. Even Malik himself, still standing by the defense table, was unsure of what this interruption meant. The judge, after a long pause, picked up the phone and held it to his ear. He spoke quietly into the receiver, his words soft and barely audible. The whole courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Was this just another delay, or was something significant about to happen? Malik could feel his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Why was the judge taking a phone call at such a critical moment? And why did it seem so important? It felt like the last thing anyone would expect during a trial, especially when the verdict was so close. The judge's voice was low but steady as he continued his conversation. Though the room was silent, Malik couldn't help but strain his ears, trying to hear what was being said. But no matter how hard he tried, the words were too muffled to understand. For a brief moment, it seemed like the phone call might lead to another delay, another frustrating wait in a long line of setbacks. But then, something changed. The judge's expression shifted, his brows furrowed as he listened, and there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. The tension in the room grew even heavier, and Malik's pulse quickened. The entire courtroom seemed to be waiting for the next move. What was this phone call about, and why was it making the judge react this way? Malik glanced at his mother, sitting quietly in the back, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, something was about to change. The phone call continued for a few more moments, with the judge nodding in response to whoever was on the other end. Then, to everyone's surprise, the judge's gaze lifted from the phone, and he addressed the courtroom. His voice was different now, sharper, more urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his words cutting through the silence, "we are going to take a brief recess. I need to address something of great importance." The room buzzed with murmurs as everyone processed what was happening. A recess was not unusual, but the way the judge had spoken, the change in his tone, left everyone wondering if this was something more. Malik felt a strange sense of anticipation rising in him. He didn't know what the phone call had been about, but it seemed like it was important. important enough to stop the trial in its tracks. As the courtroom began to empty, Malik's mind was filled with questions. Who had called? What had been said? He couldn't understand why the judge's reaction was so different, so charged with urgency. Could this phone call be the break he'd been waiting for? Or was it just another distraction, another twist in a case that seemed destined for failure? Malik didn't know what to think, but one thing was certain. Something was changing, and he could feel the shift in the air. The uncertainty still weighed heavily on him, but now there was a glimmer of hope, just enough to keep him going. As he sat down at the defense table, his thoughts were a whirlwind of possibilities. What would happen next? And would this strange phone call lead to the justice he so desperately needed? The recess felt longer than expected. Malik sat in the courtroom, trying to process everything that had just happened. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, hope, and fear. The phone call had interrupted the trial at the most critical moment. The judge had sounded so different after the call, his usual stern demeanor replaced by an almost uncertain one. Malik couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was unfolding, but what? He had no idea what had been said during that phone call, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. It was the first time in hours that he allowed himself to feel something other than fear, hope. The minutes seemed to drag on, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. Malik's defense attorney, Mr. Thompson, paced back and forth near the defense table. He had been quiet since the recess was called, his hands clasped together, his face lined with concentration. Malik wanted to ask him what had happened during the call, but he didn't have the courage. He wasn't sure he could handle another disappointment. And if the phone call meant nothing, it would be another crushing blow. His mother sat nearby, her eyes locked on Malik, filled with silent support. She had been so strong throughout the trial, but Malik could see the worry in her eyes now. She wanted this nightmare to end just as much as he did. His sister, sitting next to her, was still trying to understand what was happening. The whole family had been waiting for this moment, praying for the truth to come out. Malik wished he could feel more certain about the outcome, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were still fragile. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the judge returned to the courtroom. The room fell silent as everyone waited for him to speak. Malik's stomach churned. The phone call, the recess, everything led to this moment. What would the judge say? Would the case continue as it had before, or had something changed? Judge Peterson walked to his seat, his face still carrying the weight of whatever had happened during the call. He didn't immediately address the courtroom. Instead, he sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Malik's eyes locked on the judge, trying to read his expression, but it was still hard to decipher. The judge's eyes flickered briefly toward the prosecutor, Mr. Davis, then to Malik, and then back to the room at large. "I've received new information," Judge Peterson began, his voice steady but firm. "It has come to my attention that there may be more to this case than we originally understood." The words hit Malik like a wave, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. Could it be? Was the judge finally acknowledging that there might have been something wrong with the case all along? Malik's heart skipped a beat. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Hope surged within him, but he still didn't know what to expect. The prosecutor, Mr. Davis, stood up quickly, a look of concern flashing across his face. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we have already presented our case. The evidence against the defendant is clear. There is no reason to believe otherwise." But Judge Peterson didn't seem swayed. He raised a hand, signaling for the room to quiet down. "I am not suggesting we dismiss the case outright," the judge said, his voice growing more resolute. "But it is clear that I must review everything thoroughly before proceeding. This is too important." Malik's defense attorney, Mr. Thompson, looked cautiously optimistic. "Your Honor, if there is new evidence, we have a right to review it and ensure that my client is not wrongfully convicted." The judge nodded, his gaze briefly meeting Malik's before turning back to the courtroom. "That's precisely the point. A thorough investigation must be conducted, and until then, I am suspending any further proceedings in this trial." Malik could hardly believe what he was hearing. The trial had been paused, not dismissed, but paused, with the promise of a closer examination of the case. His hand shook, and he fought to keep his composure. He had been given a second chance, a breath of hope where none had existed before. The prosecutor seemed flustered but didn't argue further. Malik's mother let out a small, relieved sigh. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Malik allowed himself a small smile. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but this was something. The wheels of justice were turning, and Malik finally felt like there was a possibility for the truth to come out. As the courtroom began to empty, Malik could barely contain the rush of emotions flooding through him. He wasn't free yet, but for the first time, he saw a way forward. His innocence was still uncertain, but with the trial paused, he had a fighting chance. He had to keep believing. This wasn't over, not yet. But now, for the first time in a long time, Malik felt like the scales of justice might finally tip in his favor. The days following the judge's announcement felt like a blur. Malik couldn't focus on anything but the weight of what had happened. His mind raced with the possibility that the truth could finally come to light. He had never imagined he'd get a chance like this. After everything, the long hours of being accused, the lies, and the uncertainty, this small pause in the trial was more than just a break. It was a lifeline. Malik's family, too, seemed to breathe a little easier. His mother and sister were more relaxed, though they still carried the heaviness of the situation. They had waited so long to see justice, but they knew that this wasn't the end of the road. The trial had been suspended, yes, but they didn't know for how long. The thought of waiting even longer for the truth to be fully uncovered was exhausting. They had to trust that the pause would bring the answers they desperately needed. Malik's defense attorney, Mr. Thompson, was cautiously optimistic. He had seen the small crack in the prosecutor's case, but even he didn't know what would happen next. He told Malik to stay patient, to keep faith that the truth would eventually shine through. But patience was difficult. Every hour felt like a lifetime, and every passing day brought more doubt and anxiety. Malik couldn't stop wondering what would happen if the judge decided there wasn't enough evidence to continue the investigation. He had seen cases fall apart before, seen defendants struggle without a chance for the truth to surface. He couldn't let that happen to him. Not after everything. Meanwhile, the prosecutor, Mr. Davis, was not pleased with the judge's decision to pause the trial. He had been so certain that Malik's guilt was clear, and now it felt like his case was unraveling. He had pushed hard for Malik's conviction, and now he was forced to step back. Malik could see the tension in the prosecutor's face when the trial was delayed. He was determined to keep pressing the charges, but now the burden of proof rested on him to show why the case should continue. Malik spent his days in the small, quiet moments at home with his family. He had been given time to think, to breathe, but it was difficult to relax. His thoughts kept drifting back to the phone call, the one that had changed everything. Who had called the judge? What new information had been uncovered? Malik had so many questions, but no answers. All he knew was that the phone call had shaken everything up. It had opened a door, and now the truth was out there, waiting to be discovered. But who would find it? And would it be in time to save him? As Malik's attorney began to dig deeper into the case, he found some inconsistencies that had been overlooked before. There were gaps in the prosecutor's story, small details that didn't add up. Malik's fingerprint on the piece of evidence was smudged. There was no way to tell for sure if they even belonged to him. The so-called eyewitnesses who had placed Malik at the scene of the crime had conflicting testimonies. Some claimed to have seen him from far away. Others couldn't even describe what he looked like. The more Mr. Thompson examined the case, the clearer it became that the prosecution had been rushing to judgment, relying on unreliable evidence and shaky witnesses. The more the defense team uncovered, the more hopeful Malik became. The truth was starting to take shape, piece by piece, like a puzzle that had been locked away for too long. But with each new piece, Malik also realized the larger picture of corruption that surrounded his case. The prosecutor had been so eager to convict him, but why? Why was he so determined to pin this crime on Malik? Malik couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a simple mistake. His attorney, Mr. Thompson, told him to stay focused. "We're making progress," he said. "The pieces are falling into place, but we have to keep pushing. The truth is out there, Malik. We just have to make sure it gets seen." But Malik wasn't so sure. The more he thought about it, the more questions he had. What if the truth was too much for anyone to handle? What if the people who had tried to frame him had done so for a reason bigger than just one crime? It was hard not to be overwhelmed by all the possibilities. But as the days passed, Malik tried to stay hopeful. He knew that the truth would come out eventually. He just had to hold on a little longer. As the days passed, Malik felt the weight of anticipation hanging over him. The trial had been paused, but the uncertainty of what would come next still loomed large. His family, though relieved that there was a brief moment of hope, couldn't fully relax. The reality of the situation had not changed. They were still stuck in a fight against a system that had already made up its mind about Malik's fate. No one had said it out loud, but Malik could feel it. This break in the trial was just the beginning. It was a small victory, but the battle was far from over. Malik spent his days reflecting on the phone call and the strange turn the trial had taken. The judge's sudden change in demeanor had shaken everyone. Malik kept asking himself what had happened, who had called, what had they said. It was hard to make sense of it all. The only thing he knew for sure was that the trial was no longer a straightforward path. There were cracks in the case now, small but significant ones, and Malik had a feeling that, in time, those cracks would widen. His attorney, Mr. Thompson, was working diligently, reviewing every detail of the case. The inconsistencies in the prosecutor's evidence were starting to show more clearly. The witness statements, which had initially seemed solid, now appeared unreliable. There were too many gaps in the story, too many unanswered questions. Malik's fingerprints, for example, weren't as conclusive as the prosecution had made them out to be. The smudged prints could have belonged to anyone. The more Malik thought about it, the more he realized how much the prosecution had rushed to judgment. And Mr. Thompson, with every piece of new information, was growing more confident that the case against Malik wasn't as strong as everyone had believed. But even as hope grew, Malik couldn't ignore the fear that remained. What if the judge didn't see it the way Mr. Thompson did? What if the prosecutor found a way to turn things around? It wasn't just the evidence that scared Malik. It was the bigger question of what would happen if the system, after all this, still failed him. One evening, as Malik sat quietly with his mother and sister at their kitchen table, the weight of everything seemed to hit him all at once. His mother was talking to him softly, trying to keep his spirits up, but even she seemed exhausted by the uncertainty. Malik could feel the strain in her voice. His sister, too, was growing restless. The future seemed so unclear, and there were times when Malik felt like giving up, like the pressure was too much to bear. But every time he looked at his family, he remembered why he had to keep going. They believed in him, even when the world didn't. He thought about what it meant to be a young man in a world that didn't always see him for who he was. He had always tried to be good, to do what was right, but in a moment's time, he had been labeled something he wasn't. This trial was more than just a courtroom drama. It was a reflection of everything that was wrong in the world. Malik wasn't just fighting for his own freedom. He was fighting against a system that had already decided his fate, long before the trial had even started. The days of waiting dragged on, but then, one morning, Malik's phone rang. It was Mr. Thompson calling with news that sent a jolt through his entire body. "The judge has called for a new hearing," Mr. Thompson said. "There's been a breakthrough. The evidence we've uncovered is going to be presented in court. This could be it, Malik. The moment we've been waiting for." Malik felt a rush of emotions: disbelief, relief, and hope. The trial was about to resume, and this time, things would be different. The weight that had been pressing on him for so long lifted, if only for a moment. For the first time in days, Malik allowed himself to smile. It wasn't over, but it was closer than it had ever been. The truth was finally coming to light. The day of the new hearing arrived with a feeling of anxious anticipation hanging in the air. Malik sat in the courtroom once more, but this time, things felt different. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of possibility. His family was there too, sitting behind him in the gallery, their faces hopeful but still uncertain. Malik's mother held his hand tightly, her fingers wrapped around his, offering silent strength. His sister, still too young to understand everything, just looked at him with wide eyes, trusting that everything would be okay. As Malik looked around the room, he noticed that this time, the people watching seemed more engaged. The judge, who had seemed so unmovable in the past, looked like he was taking the proceedings much more seriously. The prosecutor, Mr. Davis, had lost some of the cocky confidence he had once had. It was clear to Malik that everyone in the courtroom knew that something had shifted. The defense had presented its findings, and the judge had ordered that the case be reopened. The inconsistencies in the evidence had become impossible to ignore, and Malik's attorney, Mr. Thompson, was ready to show everyone what they had missed. There were gaps in the witness testimonies, contradictions that couldn't be explained away. The fingerprints, which had once been presented as crucial evidence, were now being questioned. They were too smudged to be definitive. There were no clear marks linking Malik to the crime scene. As Mr. Thompson made his arguments, Malik couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. For the first time since the trial began, the scales seemed to be tipping in his favor. Mr. Thompson spoke with confidence, pointing out every flaw in the prosecution's case, backing it up with facts and evidence that had been ignored before. Judge Peterson listened intently. He didn't interrupt. He just let the defense speak, letting the evidence settle in the courtroom. For Malik, it was almost surreal. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the truth could be seen, when the lies that had trapped him for so long would finally be uncovered. The prosecutor tried to fight back, of course. Mr. Davis didn't want to let go of the case so easily. He tried to discredit the defense's findings, casting doubt on the validity of the new evidence. But it was clear that the judge was no longer convinced by his arguments. After hours of tense arguments and discussions, it was time for the judge to make his decision. Malik's heart raced in his chest as he sat in the dock, his eyes fixed on Judge Peterson. His family sat nervously behind him, all of them holding their breath. Malik didn't know what was going to happen next. He had seen how easily things could slip away before, but today, something felt different. Today, he felt like the truth was finally going to win. Judge Peterson cleared his throat and stood up. He glanced at both the defense and the prosecution before addressing the courtroom. His voice was steady but firm as he spoke. "I have carefully considered the arguments presented today," the judge said. "After reviewing all the evidence and taking into account the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, I have decided that the charges against Malik Johnson will be dropped. There is not enough evidence to continue with the trial, and the case is hereby dismissed." The words rang out, clear and final, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Malik's heart leaped in his chest, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just heard. It wasn't over. He was free. The weight that had been crushing him for so long suddenly lifted. His hands trembled as he looked at his family, who were all in tears, their faces filled with relief and joy. Malik stood up, unable to believe that the nightmare was finally over. He walked toward his attorney, Mr. Thompson, who had a proud, satisfied smile on his face. "You did it," Malik said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson simply nodded, his eyes full of warmth. "No, Malik. You did it. You kept believing in the truth, even when it seemed impossible. That's what made all the difference." Malik turned to his family, who had risen to their feet, their faces alight with emotion. His mother pulled him into a tight hug, whispering how proud she was of him, how much she had always believed in him. His sister smiled at him through her tears, and Malik felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. They had been his strength through it all. As Malik walked out of the courtroom, he felt a sense of freedom he hadn't known in months. He had been through so much, accused of something he didn't do, trapped in a system that seemed stacked against him. But now, finally, he had been cleared. He was innocent, and the world could see that.